Today on the Diabetes Podcast.
Pregnancy creates insulin resistance on purpose. Gestational diabetes isn't just, it's just something that happened and then once I deliver the baby, it goes away, everything's fine. On so many different levels, it can increase your risk of developing type 2 diabetes. You had these increased demands on your pancreas and you had this state of created insulin resistance, and all things remaining the same, this will eventually progress to prediabetes or type 2 diabetes.
Hello and welcome to the Diabetes Podcast. I'm Richie.
And I'm Amber. And today we're going to talk about diabetes before birth and how fertility is affected by metabolism, how future diabetes risk and offspring can be affected by metabolism.
So we're normally advocating to be proactive on this, particularly as it relates to, say, prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. This is proactive on a level that we have not done to date. We're talking about how to not only affect your best outcomes, but really the best setting your children that do not currently exist up for success as it relates to metabolic health.
Yes. So one of the questions I've been asked hundreds of times over the past 20 years is, as it pertains to gestational diabetes is, what could I have done differently? How could I have kept this from happening? Was it my fault? And that was it my fault piece is the heartbreaking question that really led me to want to cover gestational diabetes with more understanding and compassion and really have a better idea of what's going on behind the scenes and before anyone became pregnant or knew that diabetes was something they had to consider with regards to pregnancy. Like, what is all that about? So, usually that question has to do with somebody being diagnosed with diabetes or prediabetes, but when it comes to gestational, I think somehow it's even more heartbreaking because you have somebody who's excited about pregnancy, nervous in the middle of decorating a nursery, wondering what it's like to be mom for the first time, all the things. And then they get a phone call.
Let's inject some fear into what was a really happy situation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And often the words that are used are you failed your glucose tolerance test. And I think words can be really powerful and no one really likes to hear the words you failed. I don't like hearing those words. I mean, even though I have an understanding that you have to fail oftentimes to learn and progress. Mm-hmm. Like I have a more evolved understanding of failure, but I still, somebody called me up and said, you failed your test. I would be like, whoa, what do you mean? Oh no. Like it feels like a personal attack any way you slice it. And so I've just had so many heartbreaking conversations with women who felt like the joy of pregnancy was very interrupted by fear. And they ask things like, was it something that I ate? Is this going to hurt my baby? And I want to answer that question, not with my own personal opinion, definitely not with shame or with social media advice, but with some physiology. And there's something I've learned after all this time of working with people with diabetes, and it's that physiology is physiology. It doesn't judge you. There's no moral standing with physiology. It kind of explains you. And once you understand what's happening inside your body, fear often gives way to this understanding and sometimes acceptance, but definitely some empowerment with there's something that I can do about this. And hopefully then confidence that can lead to better decisions where applicable and where appropriate. And my hope for today's episode is not that you just learn a few more fun facts about gestational diabetes, but that you view your body differently, as not something that failed you, but as something that was trying to accomplish one of the most astounding physiologic feats that a body can go through, which is pregnancy. And so, I'm just excited about that. And the reason I wanted to do this series is that we spent a lot of time talking about insulin resistance. And I think it's in that we talk about the liver, we talk about the pancreas, the muscle, the gut microbiome, inflammation, the brain, all of these remarkable systems that work together to regulate blood sugar. But oftentimes we start talking about that pathophysiology at the time of diagnosis when the A1C is 6.5. And oftentimes there's this belief, because this is talked about at diagnosis, that everything was hunky-dory until that diagnosis. And now, like, this flip was switched and now everything's wrong. And I wish I could go back to yesterday before any of this happened. And the truth is, often with type 2 diabetes and with metabolic dysfunction, these things are happening 10, 15, 20 years prior to that moment where the switch got flipped. And so just wanted to say, it's before that fasting blood sugar of 126 that there was some impaired glucose tolerance, some insulin resistance going on. And when somebody is told they have gestational diabetes, that is still very much the case, that usually this is something like it's very often rare. That's where the pathophysiology began for gestational diabetes. It's been that the body's been compensating and adjusting, working overtime, trying to maintain balance for some time. And that's a really beautiful thing. Homeostasis is quite a beautiful thing about normal human physiology. If something's not working over here, let's overcompensate over here. And if this is broken, let's overcompensate here. But over time, when so many things are overcompensating, that's when things begin to break down. And it's no different for gestational diabetes. So we're going to replace blame with understanding. And throughout this episode, I really want to talk about truth, which is when the adaptation fails, when you have these other areas working to overcompensate, but then that adaptation that was overcompensating, when that mechanism fails and creates what we understand as the disease process of certain things, but for this, gestational diabetes. So then within that are opportunities to discover, what to change about what comes next. So I just want to appreciate, before we get into gestational diabetes any further, pregnancy itself and all of the things that the body does to grow a new human. I think just appreciating that you have this single fertilized egg, and just the fact that the egg becomes fertilized is another miracle. And I don't know, the first time I ever watched a video that was where the technology was good enough to show the sperm swimming and all of the obstacles to overcome to get to the egg and be the one sperm that gets through to fertilize it. It was just quite a miracle that anyone becomes pregnant, but we know a lot of people become pregnant, and just that teeny tiny egg becomes a baby with a heart, a brain, lungs, eyes, little tiny fingers, toes. And then within 9 months, you have this completely new human with all of these formed organs inside of it. And your own body builds its own organ, the placenta. And that organ didn't exist before pregnancy, and it doesn't exist after pregnancy. You just build a new organ and build a new human inside the new organ. It's just fascinating. And then your heart is pumping dramatically more blood. Your blood volume expands nearly 50%, which is just astronomical. The kidneys increase their filtration. The immune system changes. The hormones change. Metabolism changes. Almost every system in your body adapts to all of these changes. So it's not really like, why does your metabolism change during pregnancy? And it does, and we'll talk about that. But it's more like, how could it not when you increase blood volume by 150% and you grow another human? Like, of course, everything is changing. Everything is adapting because your body isn't just sustaining one life anymore. You're growing a whole new life. So that leads to one of the most surprising things about pregnancy physiology, and that is it creates a system of insulin resistance. So
it normally creates?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Pregnancy creates insulin resistance on purpose. So normally insulin resistance, we've spent I think just about every single episode we've done, we've talked about how insulin resistance is the devil, really it's a bad thing. You don't want this to happen. But in pregnancy, it's very necessary. It is what has to happen in order for the baby to be fed and get nourishment. So one of the major players in this process of creating insulin resistance in pregnancy is the placenta, this new organ that your body has made. And honestly, it's such a fascinating organ in that it really just developed specifically to support the body. Its job's complete. See you later. But it's this very sophisticated communication center for 9 months. It produces hormones, transfers nutrients, delivers oxygen, removes the baby's waste products, coordinates signals between the mother and the baby. And one of its most important jobs that we're going to focus on for this episode is this fuel producing, this fuel communication, making sure that the baby's growing and getting enough fuel. So the primary fuel of the baby is glucose. We're going to get back to insulin resistance in a moment and the role that the placenta plays. But for now, the baby needs glucose for fuel, growing a new baby. And it's not because sugar is good or bad. That's just the preferred fuel source for many tissues, especially the developing fetal brain. So nature has a challenge. How do we make sure there's enough glucose available for the baby without depriving mom? And the answer is really elegant. The placenta gradually produces hormones that make mom's tissues a little less responsive to insulin. Not because something is broken or gone wrong, but because something has gone precisely right. That's how it's supposed to work. Those hormones, including human placental lactogen, placental growth hormone, progesterone, cortisol, and others, work together to progressively increase insulin resistance as pregnancy advances, especially during the second and third trimesters. So the body is going to adapt before it fails. And this is the adaptation physiology. This is on purpose. So glucose crosses the placenta, but maternal insulin does not. And okay, so the baby is making its own insulin for the glucose that's coming across from the mother into the placenta. And for now, just remember those two facts, that insulin doesn't pass over, glucose does. And
can I ask just one clarifying question real quick? So the way that you've described it, if I understand correctly, it's almost like creating a high and low pressure system, right? We've talked about the role of insulin, and if it's not working well, that the sugar is going to stay in the blood and not move into the cells. So if I have effectively not artificially, but a created high pressure system in the mom.
Or let's say if you create insulin resistance in the mom, there's going to be more glucose in the bloodstream. And the more glucose.
I'm just looking at it from the body's potential to absorb that glucose. Mm-hmm. Glucose in the bloodstream is in the mother's bloodstream is going to be what it is. But if I've created a situation in which the pressure of the resistance, in this case is probably appropriate, is higher in the mom than the baby, then it's just going to move. The sugar is going to move from the high concentration to the low concentration. It's going to ensure that the baby always has enough sugar for development and cell division and all the other kind of stuff that the baby's doing.
Yeah, it's just not. Yes, but it's not passive diffusion. Like that's not the mechanism, but your concept is not incorrect. So it's really about your body allowing more glucose into circulation. So remember that insulin is the key that unlocks the doors to the body's cells. So if insulin's there unlocking all the doors and letting all the glucose into the mother's cells, there's no glucose circulating in the bloodstream to cross the placental barrier to go to the baby.
Enough, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not that, the traditional insulin resistance would be because your muscles are kind of gunked up, like the cells are kind of gunked up, that there's resistance. The key is broken to the lock. Like none of that necessarily is happening, at least not to the degree of what would be diagnosable for type 2 diabetes. But it's more because your baby's developing needs require a continuous supply of glucose. So it's not like here and there, it's all the time needing that supply. And that's why you have that really elegant physiological adaptation that the placenta creates.
It's your body's way of making sure that the highest need for the resources is always going to be met first.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And all that to say that it's not that a baby has a parasitic nature with the body, because that's not, it's not entirely true. Yeah. Yeah. So many people assume that pregnancy creates gestational diabetes, and I'm not sure that's the most helpful way to think about it. Like, of course, if you weren't pregnant, you wouldn't have gestational diabetes, obviously. But what really is occurring is that pregnancy creates this very tremendous metabolic change, all these really tremendous metabolic changes in the body. And it asks the pancreas to do one of the hardest jobs it's going to do. And so it's asking your pancreas to produce 2-3 times as much insulin. And so another way to think of it is, let's say you're carrying a backpack that weighs 10 pounds. I'm sure you can relate to this. And you've carried
not the 10-pound version.
Okay. Yeah. You put more in your backpack, but let's just say you carried a backpack that weighed 10 pounds around for years. Like you're used to this extra 10 pounds on the backpack. You adjust, totally manageable. Then you add another 10, and then you add another 10. And eventually it's not that your back suddenly becomes weak. It's that the weight is just more than your back is able to handle, especially if you do a lot of bending over and you need to jump up in the air a couple times. The back is going to be like, excuse me, like we need to talk. It's just that the demand has become more than your body can tolerate. And pregnancy asks something quite similar of the pancreas. As insulin resistance naturally increases, the pancreas has to produce substantially more insulin just to keep up with keeping this glucose in normal range. And that's just an incredible workload. Like I said before, like 2 to 3 times the normal insulin production. But here's the remarkable thing. For most women, the pancreas is fully able to rise to the challenge. It simply produces 2 to 3 times more insulin. We got it. And the blood glucose is beautifully regulated in the mother and the baby. No gestational diabetes, no failed glucose tolerance test. The body adapts normally, and that's good physiology. That's what we hope happens. But for some women, pancreas can't completely keep pace with these increased demands, not because the mother failed on any metric, not because her placenta is somehow different than any other. It's because that metabolic demand on the pancreas could not fully compensate for what was going on. And so it's just that you've created this incredible demand. And for whatever reason, in the state of gestational diabetes, the body just can't keep up at that moment. So why do some women not meet this demand for the increased load? And why do some meet it and why do some don't is the question. And
You're going to tell us because I don't know.
right, because you think like if every woman becomes insulin resistant, then why doesn't every woman develop gestational diabetes? Like, I think that's the next logical question. But it's because insulin resistance created by the placenta is only half of the story of what's going on in gestational diabetes. So the other half is the pancreas, and even more specifically, so we talked about the pancreas ability to rise to the demand during this increased resistance. And a lot of people believe type 2 diabetes or gestational diabetes to be a blood sugar problem. And while blood sugar is what we measure, it's what we see on the finger stick monitor, on the continuous glucose monitor, but blood sugar is the result of dozens of normal physiologic and sometimes a little bit broken pathology physiologic responses to what's going on, all working together and sometimes struggling to work together. And one of those could be insulin production. So if we have two women, same age, both pregnant, both experiencing normal insulin resistance as the pregnancy begins, and their placentas are doing what they're supposed to do, hormones are doing what they're supposed to do, and it's more about, can the pancreas keep up with this 2 to 3 times demand? And for some women, the pancreas senses that insulin resistance is increasing and coming and makes more insulin, problem solved. For other women, they see that and they try to make more, but they can't make enough for the demands of the pregnancy, and the blood glucose begins to rise. It's not because the pancreas wasn't trying to compensate and make that, but they just can't. And then oftentimes their pancreas could be making more, but it's still just not enough for that woman. And so I kind of could think about it in terms of like, maybe this woman over here started with a completely empty 5-gallon bucket, and the woman over here started with a half full 5-gallon bucket. So then if you have to add 4 gallons into that bucket, the one that started with her bucket half full is going to overflow. And that's maybe an okay analogy for why some people develop this and some don't, because some people are already overcompensating and struggling before this begins.
So if I understand correctly, really it's almost before you got pregnant in the first place is kind of going to determine the likelihood, or will increase the likelihood of this occurring during your pregnancy.
Right.
Okay.
Very much so. Very much so. And that's one of the recurring themes throughout diabetes physiology, is that long before someone develops prediabetes, long before someone develops diabetes, their pancreas has been working overtime. We talked about this on a recent episode, that sometimes you've got those pancreatic beta cells that have gone to the break room because they're overworked and burnt out. So they're over in the break room. And then when you increase the demand and increase the load, nothing about that is going to keep them from already being burnt out, which they are. So their pancreas could have already been compensating for years before this happens. And yeah, so you've got this really unique condition of a window into being able to see what might be a little bit broken, if you will. And by broken, I don't mean the person, of course. I mean that pathophysiology could be beginning. And so this kind of shines a light on something that's already there in the first place. So yeah, it's just the demand exceeding the capacity. And this is a unique situation where the demand increases so rapidly that it shows chinks in the armor, if you will. So yeah, and it's not that genetics don't play a role or that they don't matter in this as well, because they do, and they can influence how much your what the capacity of your pancreas to produce could be. They can influence how sensitive your tissues are to insulin, especially if genetics can influence where you tend to store body fat. And if you tend to store body fat on your hips and around upper body or hips, you'd be less prone to developing gestational diabetes as someone who is genetically predisposed to storing fat around their visceral organs, around their midsection and waist. So genetics can influence the hand that you're dealt, but they don't influence how many cards are played in the deck, if you will. So now we can talk about risk factors for this. They're not random. There are some commonalities found throughout gestational diabetes and who's at more risk than somebody else. And so some of them would be polycystic ovarian syndrome, increases the risk of gestational diabetes.
Which, correct me if I'm wrong, I do believe we're going to talk about this in one of the other episodes.
That's why we're going to cover this in another episode, because this creates significant insulin resistance before somebody becomes pregnant. That also increases insulin resistance. And so we have that entire next episode we're going to devote to that. And women with a history of gestational diabetes in the past have already demonstrated that there could be a struggle. So they tend to be a higher risk factor. And then, of course, the excess visceral fat, the same thing that would be a risk of developing prediabetes or type 2 diabetes could be a risk of developing gestational diabetes. A strong family history could suggest those insulin sensitivity differences among genetics. Increased maternal age is associated with a gradual decline in beta cell function and increasing insulin resistance in many people. And then certain racial and ethnic populations have higher rates of gestational diabetes, which just reflects this very complex interplay of genetics and environment and social determinants of health as well. It's not like just ethnicity oftentimes. So every single one of those can influence insulin resistance or the pancreas' ability to compensate. So it's different pathways, but the same problem in the end, which is not being able to keep up with the demands that are placed. So obesity could be another thing, and you don't have to be obese to develop gestational diabetes. And also, if you're obese, it doesn't mean that you're going to have gestational diabetes. You can be a runner, a healthcare professional, someone who has exercised throughout their entire pregnancy and still develop gestational diabetes. So we're talking about risk. We're not talking about absolutes. You know, it might increase your risk, but you're still fine. Or you have all these increased risk factors and you do, in fact, develop gestational diabetes. It just depends. And so it's not about, if only I had weighed less, or if only I had done this thing. It's way more complex than that. And, you know, the truth is that oversimplified messages aren't really that helpful. It's a very complex thing that's happening. So let's move on to the fact that the baby has a pancreas too. And, you know, I talked about glucose crossing the placenta, but insulin from the mom does not. So that means that the baby has to have the pancreas to produce the insulin for this. So you've got your little baby with this little baby pancreas working and responding to the glucose in the body and getting prepared for life outside of mom. And so if mom's glucose is rising, that glucose crosses the placenta very easily, but the insulin doesn't. And the baby's pancreas has to respond to any increased glucose that's crossing over. And that's exactly what it's supposed to do, because insulin's job is to move glucose out of the bloodstream and into the cells where it can be stored for energy or used for energy. And it's still this normal physiology. But insulin, while it's lowering sugar, it's also a very important anabolic hormone and not as a growth hormone. And it tells cells we've got nutrients available, let's build. And during pregnancy, that's a normal and wonderful thing. Babies are supposed to grow. But what could happen is if the baby's cells are exposed to these higher glucose levels and higher insulin levels than it otherwise normally would have had, and because insulin promotes growth, some babies could become larger than expected for their gestational age. And that's where you might hear terms like macrosomia or large for gestational age. And I just want to be clear that pregnancy is months long. So it's not just one high blood sugar that can cause this. It's more about a pattern of high sugars across time. And it's not one blood sugar that's going to define this. And babies are also incredibly resilient. And it's not about getting all the blood sugar numbers perfect. And that's why, you're just trying to get the blood sugars as close to normal as possible. And oftentimes in gestational diabetes, if that cannot be done through nutrition changes, which usually involve increasing the fiber in the diet, the timing of protein with carbohydrates and fat, ensuring that you're getting proper nutrients and movement, especially following meals, all of these things.
Pretty much the same stuff we recommend for everybody, right?
It's the same things that we generally talk about on our podcast. But because the needs are so far increased, sometimes it can be more than someone could do. You're carrying extra weight. The demands on the pancreas are 2 to 3 times as much. And so it could be true that someone would need to inject insulin during the second or third trimester of their pregnancy if the sugars are not well controlled. And the reason for this is that metformin, your sulfonylureas that are generally recognized as safe before pregnancy, those do, so insulin does not cross into the placenta, but metformin has been shown to be in the placenta, as does a sulfonylurea. So, and then it also shows sometimes larger babies and more over fat babies at age like 1 or 2 when women have been on metformin. So in general, insulin is recommended to control the blood sugars while somebody is pregnant. So back to what we started in the very beginning, it is best to recognize your risk factors and plan and control the sugars prior to becoming pregnant so that as these needs increase demand throughout the pregnancy, you are better prepared to deal with it.
So I know that on the podcast before, you've recommended for at least the aging population, if not the general population, you've recommended to get the insulin resistance test done, which is not the typical blood test. You'd have to request that. Is for somebody who is looking...
You mean circulating insulin levels, fasting insulin levels?
Yes. For somebody that is looking to get pregnant in the near or within the next several months, would this be a good test to get just to kind of know where you're going to start from? You talked about that half full bucket.
Yeah, I think it makes perfect sense because if you've already got elevated circulating insulin levels prior to becoming pregnant, that could be a sign that it would be more challenging for your body to have 2 to 3 times the insulin production that the insulin resistance created through pregnancy, through that condition that the body creates.
This is kind of interesting because, normally we tell people that it's not, working with us is not like I need to lose a bunch of weight for a wedding, right? There's a dress that I want to wear and they're going to be pictures. Yeah. So there's an event that I'm specifically going to almost dietarily train for, that as soon as it's over, I can go back to living normal. This is, and again, brain's kind of spinning right now. This is kind of the first time I ever thought of training for pregnancy, for lack of a better description. What would it look like if I knew that for those that are trying to get pregnant, what would it look like if I knew that 6 months, a year, 2 years out, I need to start seriously thinking about what is the metabolic condition of my body to be able to provide not just the safest environment for my baby to grow, but to have as minimal effect on my baby's long-term health as possible. That's kind of wild. I don't think anybody's doing that.
Yeah.
Or not a lot of people.
Right. And that is the premise of this podcast, to see that gestational diabetes isn't just, it's just something that happened. And then once I deliver the baby, it goes away, everything's fine. It is insight into a condition that is under the surface so the risk of developing diabetes for somebody who had gestational diabetes, I think it's a 50% increased risk. And then every 10 years older that you get, that risk increases incrementally. So it's like on so many different levels, it can increase your risk of developing type 2 diabetes. And I don't think it's that because you had gestational diabetes, your risk is increased. I think it's more that you had these increased demands on your pancreas and you had this state of created insulin resistance, and it gave us insight into a problem that was underneath the surface, some issues of metabolism, some overcompensating that was happening. And all things remaining the same, this will eventually progress to prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. And so there's a lot of common threads between having gestational diabetes and being diagnosed with diabetes later or even sooner. And so the recommendation is that every few years you get the same kind of test done that somebody would get done who's concerned for prediabetes or diabetes, where you'd get an A1C lab or a fasting glucose. I would recommend every year. I mean, I always have a fasting lab when I have my annual with my primary care physician. And I do that not because I ever had gestational diabetes, but because it's just a great idea to track.
I'm wondering, for women that not only have multiple children, but multiple children in a relatively tight timeline, if increased insulin resistance is a normal part of pregnancy, and I'm going to, just say I'm going to spend the better part of a year in a normalized resistance to insulin level, and I'm doing this multiple years, you're really, I'm aware that pregnancy is hard on the body, but I mean, that's really hard on the body.
Yeah. I love that you said that, because I think I've always known what you said, but I didn't connect the dots until you said it that way. It's pretty phenomenal. Yeah. And I think about, someone that we know and love, their fourth child had the shoulder dystocia, if I'm saying that right, where the shoulder dislocates because of the macrosomia. The bigger baby creates a more challenging delivery for the mother. Yeah. It's very interesting. So if you notice that you're having a harder time controlling the blood sugars while pregnant, that is your prediabetes warning flag, if you will. And it's definitely something to not say, whoo, that pregnancy's over. Thank goodness I don't have to take that insulin anymore or do this again. Let that be your hey, this is what it could be like if you don't make changes now, which is a little bit challenging because you're also entering into a new baby and all of the stress and challenges and sleep deprivation and all of that. And now let's also think about a risk of type 2 diabetes later on. That's later on. That's not the dirty diaper in front of my face or this baby. And so we'll also talk about lactation, and we'll talk about other things in this series that can help reduce the risk for mother and baby, a couple of other things.
So a little bit of a curveball. Normally we talk about things that you can do to make it better. I'm going to ask for 2 today. One for those that are currently pregnant and newly diagnosed with gestational diabetes, and one for those that are thinking about getting pregnant in the future. What's some low-hanging fruit that both of those populations can adopt this week to either reduce the risk of this happening or to give that growing baby the best chance of being well?
First thing I would say, you're usually not that newly pregnant and having gestational diabetes, because typically it's that oral glucose tolerance test is done at about 25 weeks. If you've had gestational diabetes in the past, or if they think you're at a really high risk, they might do it around 18 weeks. But usually around that time, if you're told you have gestational diabetes, absolutely see a registered dietitian, a certified diabetes care and education specialist, an endocrinologist. You really need a highly specialized team that have dealt with this before and know how to manage this, because nutrition is personal, nutrition is specialized, and I will say that the American Diabetes Association does not recommend any kind of ketogenic diet or high protein, does not recommend any kind of diet like that while you're pregnant, and really focuses on getting variety of fruits and vegetables and lean sources of protein and monitoring your sodium intake. So more of DASH, which is dietary approaches to stop hypertension, and Mediterranean style diets. So you could pretty much Google or do whatever and get
it
some
sounds
DASH or
almost
Mediterranean.
more micronutrition than macronutrition focused. Really, just making sure that the nutrient density of your food is very obviously the baby. You're going to make sure that that there's no nutritional deficiencies in that. Sounds like if you're focused on making sure, like what you said, the vitamins and minerals and fiber that you're getting from a variety of plant-based stuff is going to pretty much take care of most of the micro stuff, and also make sure that you're fuller and
Well, and that's why a registered dietitian, diabetes educator could look at that, because I believe in personalized nutrition, and everything is unique to the individual, and there's a lot of nuance. And if you could have a great diet for the most part and completely sabotaged in one area. And so you could fix that one area and improve your nutritional quality by 40%. I mean, you don't know what you don't know. And that's the biggest thing to understand. And so working with someone who can help see things that you don't and show you how things can improve would be very helpful. And so I don't know that the recommendations would change for someone diagnosed with gestational diabetes versus someone. I mean, obviously the person looking to get pregnant is a unique opportunity to look at how they move, and are they getting at least 150 minutes of physical activity a week? And are they eating 5 to 9 servings of fruits and vegetables? Are they drinking liquid calories? Those are great places to start. So, and don't drink liquid calories. That's
right.
That's the goal.
Okay. All right. So what are we talking about next week?
Polycystic ovarian syndrome next week. And then there's 2 other areas to cover as we work through this series.
All right. Well, this has been very educational for me. Not really a lot of historical context, even in just, picking your brain on a lot of stuff. So this is all good. We will talk to you again next week on the Diabetes Podcast. Thanks for listening to the Diabetes Podcast. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the channel to make sure you're notified when new episodes launch. And until next time, take courage. You can do this, and we can help.